survived the last session and came back for more.
Exactly.
Is this the old winding way?
Right, remember there were like 4 houses on it and we only did 2. I'm guessing he's back for the other 2. Single family resident, yeah, he's back for the other 2.
Ready to go? Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call the February 3rd, 2020 meeting of the San Carlos Planning Commission to order. As always, we start each meeting with the Pledge of Allegiance to our great flag and country. I invite everyone to join us now. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Lisa, could we have the roll call, please?
Commissioner Roof,
Present.
Commissioner Garvey,
Present.
Commissioner Bradley, Vice Chair Iacoponi,
Here.
and Chair Dugan.
Here. Yeah, we'll now move to public comment. Open for general public comment for any items not on tonight's agenda. Is there anyone here this evening that would like to speak on something not on the agenda? I have no speaker cards. Very well. Moving on. This is the public hearing. We have 2 items we will consider this evening. And first, we will look at 626 Walnut Street and potentially continuing that item to a date uncertain. Staff?
Yes, Chair Dugan and Commissioners. 626 Walnut, which was the application for a total of 35 new residential condominium units at 626 Walnut, was presented to the Commission at your last meeting on Tuesday, January the 21st. And staff is currently doing some research as indicated in the memo that's within your packet, and that research is taking a little bit more time. So as we've indicated in the report and as I would be recommending now, is that we recommend that the Commission make a motion, someone make a motion and a second to continue it to a date uncertain, because it's not clear as when we'll be able to conclude that research.
Okay, do we have any sense, is it a month away, 2 months away? Any sense of that at this time? Or?
No, I don't have a particular sense. I don't think it will be necessarily 3 months away, but I think it could be within the next month or month and a half,
okay,
where we might be able to bring that back.
Terrific. Yeah, I do think this is an important issue, and as staff is reviewing the below market rate policy for unbundled parking, I would just ask that staff considers what our policy should be after this project as well. Very good. Any other questions of staff, Commissioners?
Well, I'll move that the Planning Commission continue the request for design review, tentative map, below market rate housing plan, use permit, and transportation demand management plan for the project at 626 Walnut Street, APN 050-131-060-070 and 080, to a date uncertain.
I'll second it.
Terrific. We have a motion that's been seconded. A roll call, please.
Commissioner Roof?
Yes.
Commissioner Garvey?
Yes.
Commissioner Bradley?
Yes.
Vice Chair Iacoponi?
Yes.
And Chair Dugan.
Yes. Terrific. We will now move on to new business, and we'll consider an amendment to the municipal code regarding parking in lieu fees.
Thank you, everyone. So my name is Adam Aronson. I am the Economic Development Coordinator for the city. And so I'm here tonight to give you a presentation on the proposed amendment to Municipal Code Chapter 3.36, Parking Exception Fund, probably more commonly referred to as the Parking in Lieu Fee. So to start with some background, in 1970, the council adopted Ordinance 701 to establish a parking fund for the purpose of depositing funds and dispersing funds received, which would be used for the acquisition and improvement of public parking facilities. Soon after that, the parking in lieu fee was established at $6,500 per space. And then in 1999, a study was conducted increasing the fee to $13,000 and then tying the increases to the Consumer Price Index. Then in 2011, the zoning ordinance was updated to clarify that a fee can be paid in lieu of providing parking for projects that are within a parking assessment district. I'll show you a map of where those are on the next slide. And then it further expanded how the funds could be used. So they can also be used for more transit-oriented uses that would help to mitigate parking. Today, with the increases in CPI, the fee now stands at $17,936 per space. So the fee only applies when a project is located within a parking assessment district. So you can see on the map here, there are 4 different districts that overlay each other. They really just cover the downtown area on the 600, 700, and 800 blocks of Laurel Street. And then the fee is also only enacted when one of 2 things occurs. Either square footage is added through the project or a change of use occurs. So say a retail-oriented establishment turns into more of a restaurant.
What are the multiple colors signifying here? Just we have different zones and they overlap.
There are different districts established in different years. The one in 60, the 70s, and that's just the different districts.
I see, but for this purpose, we can just consider everything within a line as the same?
That's correct. So everything is the same there. So recently, we engaged Economic and Planning Systems Incorporated to conduct a technical analysis on potentially updating the fee. And so the first thing that came out of this study is determining what it actually cost the city to build a parking space. So what they did is they developed an estimate based on a 3-story parking structure with 1 level underground and then 2 levels above. Part of the reason for this is that's what we've seen most recently at Wheeler Plaza, and just also with the space constraints downtown, we're most likely going to need something of that nature. Now, the amount that came out of that is $77,300 per space. One other thing to note is that this does tend to be the more expensive type of parking in a multi-level garage with underground levels as well. And part of the reason we did that also is to make sure we had a more conservative estimate that would reach the full amount. And then with this, we did a feasibility analysis. And what we did here is we took 3 different hypothetical fee amounts, $25,000, $50,000, and then the full max fee of $77,300. And then we compared that to 3 hypothetical projects. So the first was a 4-story mixed-use building with ground floor retail and residential above. The second was a 3-story mixed-use building with ground floor retail and office above. And then the last is what we most commonly are seeing right now with the parking in lieu fees, and that's conversion of a ground floor retail building to a restaurant use. And so what this table here shows you is the % increase in rent or sales price needed to offset a fee amount. So if we were to charge the max fee amount and someone was to build a 4-story building with residential above and retail on the ground floor, in order to make up the cost of that parking in lieu fee, they would need to raise rent or sell the space for a 20% higher amount. And if you go down to the $25,000 level, you'll see that there's a much lower impact. It's still fairly significant for the larger buildings, 6.7% for a 4-story mixed use, and then 14.6% for the 3-story building with office. But then for those conversions, it's only 0.5%.
Can you just clarify the increases applied to the unit or the parking space?
To the unit.
To the unit.
So if someone wanted to then sell the building or rent out an apartment in the building.
One question I had, what exactly does the fee apply towards? So obviously if someone's building a new building, it would apply, but is it also the case if someone's just proposing a new business in town, we run them through the same analysis?
So it depends whether it's a change in use or if there's additional square footage. So if it's just a restaurant turning into another restaurant, there's no extensive tenant improvements, they're not building out the building at all, then the fee wouldn't apply. If they were to build out farther, or if it was a restaurant turning into a nail salon or vice versa, then the fee could kick in. And Lisa can explain a bit more clearly than me, but it's if there's a 10% net change is when the fee comes into effect.
Thank you, Aaron. Adam, I'm sorry, I still do that after all these years. One other way to kind of think of it is that we've been talking about when the fee applies, so I'd just like to back up for a second and say it maybe a little bit differently. The fee is an option that an applicant or developer can use should their project trigger additional parking for the project. And so in cases where this happens is when there's a change of use. So in our zoning ordinance, we have a section that identifies land use classifications. And within these classifications, there could be a description of a bunch of subtypes. So as long as, and the most easiest way to explain this is if a retailer that was selling books, for example, decided to move out and another retailer that's selling kitchenware, it's kind of the same use. It's still retail. They're still using the square footage. No parking, no additional parking would be required because everything remains the same. But when we see changes in business use where you're going from retail to a restaurant, there's a different parking requirement, a different parking formula. So we calculate the number, and if the number for the new use is 10% more than what the original use would have required, then that developer or applicant needs to meet parking requirements. They can either find a way to put it on site, or if they're within the boundaries of those different color districts that you just saw, they can choose to pay the in lieu fee. So let me know if that makes sense. I can try to describe it. And another way would be, and I think most of you are familiar with, the renovations that took place on the Sneakers First Impression and First American Title, the new second-story addition on the project just across from Pachi's. When that project went forward, it generated more parking because they certainly were adding on square footage to the site. So the way that the developer satisfied their parking requirement was two ways. One, they went into an off-site parking agreement. So we have a section in our code that allows someone, if they can find the location that has excess parking spaces, they can enter into an off-site parking agreement, or they can pay the in lieu fee. And certainly, if they choose to do so and they have the space to provide it on site, they can do that as well. So again, mostly it's change of use or additional square footage that triggers the parking requirement. And that's when the in lieu fee then becomes an option should a developer choose to go that route.
Got it. And obviously it's only on increases to the parking, right? Like one more space is needed.
Correct. It's net new.
Okay.
Yeah, they don't have to go back and fulfill something that would have been required when that building originally was constructed.
Got it.
Yeah.
And when they, so change of use, one more space is required, there's no more room for parking. So it's pretty much, if you're going to change the use to a more parking intensive required activity, you're going to pay the fee. I mean, that's...
Correct. I mean, it's the less physically intrusive.
Yeah.
Physically intrusive.
And then if someone else comes along and goes back to that previous use, is it recorded that that property has already, provided in lieu for that extra space? Or every time it goes back and forth, we reassess this?
I don't think we've had a situation like that, but basically we compare it to existing versus proposed, so not the existing prior to the current. So I guess I would answer your question. It doesn't go back to what it originally was. So I guess if it went from retail to restaurant and then later from restaurant back to retail, we would then be comparing the current restaurant requirement to the proposed retail.
Got it. So if we think about the life of a building as more than, 20, 30 years, like, I think San Carlos will be here in 200 years, it's possible we could reassess this fee many different times over decades.
Correct.
Okay. Oh. All right.
Okay. And so with that, we're just pending comments from the Planning Commission, and then city staff will take this to the City Council with a recommendation as of now that the parking in lieu fee be increased from the current level of $17,936 to $25,000 per space. And the reason for that is setting the fee at $25,000 will help align the city with neighboring jurisdictions. That's a similar amount that what they're doing as well. and it'll also increase funding for future parking without significantly inhibiting future development, and in particular those one-off conversions where there's not new space. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments you have.
Commissioners?
I wonder, since the actual amount paid into this in lieu fund is relatively small, not nearly approaching what it would cost to actually build a parking garage, is it just sort of a punitive tax or an encouragement maybe to build a parking spot on site as opposed to paying the city? Because it's not, the money isn't going to help our parking situation unless a lot more gets paid into that fund and somehow gets applied to a parking garage.
Yeah, it's true. So if you consider a 100-space parking garage, it probably costs somewhere around $8 million. Right now, we have about $245,000 in that fund, so it would take quite a few years to get to that amount. I think the one important thing to remember is the recent change to the zoning ordinance in 2011 made it so that these funds could also go towards more transit-oriented projects. So if there's something that helps to mitigate parking, if there's a study to try and improve access or mobility, say a bike program, increasing bike lanes, these funds could go towards that as well.
Oh, okay.
And Mr. Chairman, if I could just add to that, the expenditures of that fund can be used for many different things, not just the creation of parking. For instance, transit passes or coupons for equipment for transit, for studies, parking studies. Currently, the city's going to use some of the money to study the South Laurel parking area. So it can be used not just for the creation of parking, but things surrounding parking and related to parking.
The $25,000 is also going to be tied to CPI going forward?
That's correct.
Okay.
And if you look in the boundaries of those colored areas, and if you apply the rules that are on in the one table from the study, how many parking spaces are sort of, does that account for?
How many parking spaces?
Yeah, I mean, has anybody sort of said, oh, gee, well, if you look at all the businesses and their uses and you apply the rules, that's 4,000 parking spaces or something?
Mr. Chairman, I think I can answer that. We did a master plan study a number of years ago, and there's about 1,000 parking spaces in the downtown area. Within this area that you see here, I think it's a bit less than that, but in the study area, I believe it was all the way from Laurel Street down to Eaton. And we don't have any parking like lots, as you know, down there. So it might be 600 or 800 in this area. The lion's share of parking, free public parking, is in this area here.
Okay. And sorry, Al, I think you're thinking within that green, within the colored area, there's 1,000, or in the central business district, there's, including on El Camino.
There's anywhere between, I'd say to average it out, maybe let's say 7. I said 68. Let's say 700, around 700 parking spaces in this, within the boundaries of the downtown area. Maybe within this, the outer ring of all these colors. Right. For instance, right now we have 265 just in Wheeler Plaza. And then we have 2 other plazas. We have South Plaza, and we have 3 others, Clark and Williams. And those all have service parking in addition to all the street parking. Right. So I'd say around that range, 600 to 800, probably around 7, and the rest of it is all kind of on-street parking going down. Yeah.
And outside of these boundaries, basically there is no in lieu fee allowed, and thus you have to come up with the required parking. Is that okay?
It could be that as businesses grow in the South Laurel area, they're finding that they're having the same challenges because the lots are small and narrow, and for them to add on, it's very difficult to, or too costly to build parking for a new floor of office or a new unit above, and it could be that they'll be asking for, some kind of a parking assessment district in the future. So it could apply elsewhere in the future.
I see.
Just as an interesting little math, if you take your 700 and you apply the $25,000 to it, and I don't know what the concept really would be, but if every one of those, if they were to double the need, so you'd have to believe over a period you'd double the need for parking, and everyone paid in the 25,000, you're at 17.5 million, which is a far cry from the 41 for the big structure. But even if, I suppose if you cut it in half, you're coming close. I guess the point maybe, and you made this, Adam, you'd have to believe a pretty substantial change triggering these fees to get paid in to actually pay for a new structure in a material way. But so that's my conclusion. Is that your view as well, or how do you think about it?
Yeah, I think I would say that's correct. There's also the studies, as you mentioned earlier. What might be the more likely scenario, rather than the city paying 100% of the cost for a new structure, would be some sort of public-private partnership,
Sure,
where we split the cost with somebody. And that's how we get our funds to, result in more parking than what we can actually afford on our own.
Adam, I had a question. Thank you, by the way, for a very good presentation, and I really liked that report from EPS in the packet. It was very helpful. When did Redwood City and San Mateo adopt their current fees? I'm curious if it's been a long time, and are they contemplating bumping them up yet again in the near future, or were these recently adopted and they're pretty firmed up for a while?
I can't give you exact dates, but I believe they're both within the last 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
It was pretty
Thank you.
recent.
I'd like to understand a little bit better who these fees could apply for. And so your example of converting a retail to a restaurant, that I understand that. But if a new building were to be constructed, would it also be able to pay in lieu fees instead of making a parking spot?
Yeah, so if it was within the parking assessment district, that's correct, as long as they met that additional square footage requirement that then triggered the new requirements for parking that was greater than 10% from what was there before.
And could that be a residential building as well as a commercial? Yes. Any building, okay.
Maybe another observation, in the great table, Table 3, and I think Ellen was talking about this, a very good report. It talks about the, I guess, the parking space required per type of use, and comparing San Carlos to other cities. And an observation is that San Carlos's requirements are lower or substantially lower than surrounding communities. Any reflection or observations around that?
No, not at the moment. It's not something we study in this specific study, but it is something the committee could want to consider in the future.
I guess I'll say I like the idea of whatever fee is recommended, that it's indexed to the CPI. It seems that some cities do that and other cities don't, and we currently do it, and I would like to see that indexing continue.
I was just wondering, so you said 270,000 is in the fund now, roughly?
About 245.
Oh, 245. And has that been growing pretty steadily? Like, how often do we end up taking in lieu fees?
Yeah, so we don't get too many projects. I think for the last few years, we've averaged about one a year. I know FY 19-20, we had 147,000 come in. Most of that was from one project. There was one other small project as well. And then FY 18-19, we had about 24,000 come in. So it can vary year to year by quite a bit, but it's usually not more than just one or two projects.
Got it. And how frequently have we been spending out of it, and any recent examples of what we've spent it on?
I know Al, I think, just referenced there's some studies going on right now. There's a parking reconfiguration study that's happening that's using some of these funds, and then also a study in South Laurel on whether or not to adopt some similar measures there as this.
I see. So we're actively looking at a new district now.
No, we're not. Well, we're responding to community concern about parking in the South Laurel area. And a number of years ago, we had a community meeting in the South Laurel area, and the concern was about some of the businesses were beginning to get popular, and people were starting to park in residential areas. As a result, the phase one actions were to lease the parking area that you see along El Camino in the south, across from Walgreens. So we did that, and that relieved some of it. And then we changed some parking standards to kind of relieve some more parking. But that's kind of the study. And so this is phase two of that study is what is going on. We're going to have another count done in the area to see the effect of those things that we implemented, to see if they're working. And then we'll report back out to the community on that particular issue. And then the other study was for I believe it was for the parking lot behind the South Plaza parking lot behind Bianchini's. We're looking at reconfiguring that to see if we can improve the number of spaces and the usage and circulation in there.
Got it. So we have no recent examples of constructing or actually developing additional parking?
With these funds, no, other than Wheeler Plaza, which we did as a public-private partnership.
Got it. And that used funds out of this fund?
No, we did it some other way, no. Okay. But we did put in money to help that, we put in land essentially to get that project done as a public-private partnership.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So is it kind of the reason we haven't been able to construct any new parking with these in lieu fees? Is it because we're not collecting enough in lieu fees? I mean, is this going to solve a problem of 40% increase and now we'll be able to develop parking?
Well, I'm not so sure that we have enough activity to generate enough funds in this particular fund to really create a lot of parking out of it. But it has helped us with these studies that where we do have an impact on parking, we can manage our supply better. We can continually improve and look at what we have, things like that. In other cities, if you have more development in the downtown, for instance, Mountain View, a number of years ago when I was working in Mountain View, oddly enough, I used the city of San Carlos as an example of creating a parking in lieu fee, which we did for the city of for the downtown area, and we did get enough money from development to help construct a very large parking structure in the downtown. So it just depends on the level of activity that's happening in your downtown. But we haven't seen that yet. Yeah.
Okay. And when you said there's been roughly one a year, is that one project or one space about?
One project.
One project. And on average, I would guess it's mostly going from retail 2.5 to restaurant 4.0. So it's probably each of those is probably several parking spaces, I would imagine.
So, no.
Yeah, I can give you a little bit of background through that, Chair Dugan. So I started here in January of 2013, and since I've been here, we've only had two projects that triggered where the developer opted to use the in lieu fee option. And the first one was the tenant improvements at the Sneakers First American Title, the second story addition of the project that I just told you about. I think that's the 600 Laurel. Mm-hmm. And then I think that was collected in 2018, 2019. And then the other project that you may remember is an actual conditional use permit project for the existing Gin's dry cleaners right next to the little Pocket Park, or Frank Harrington Pocket Park, because that was personal services type of land use classification, and that was going to a bar / entertainment use. It definitely generated the need for 8 parking spaces, so 8 times 17,936 thereabouts is our current parking in lieu fee amount. required the applicant to pay about $143,000 in order to meet the parking requirement for that particular change in use. And in addition, there was a small little addition out the rear end, the back of the building. So in combination with the slight adjustment at the rear of the building, in combination with the change of use, that generated the need for 8 additional parking spaces, which they opted to pay in lieu fees for.
Got it. And I do actually remember that project, and I remember what I was struck by that was that this is a tenant coming in. You know, it's kind of, and I don't, maybe this isn't an important distinction, but it just struck me that, you know, if you're developing a new building, adding a second floor, and you own the thing, it's kind of a forever change, and, you know, here's the in lieu fee. But for a tenant to come in, opening up a restaurant, I was just struck that they would, you know, write a 6-figure check of parking in lieu fees to get a restaurant open in town. I don't know. I was just struck by that. Is there any distinction made in any of our neighboring communities between tenants' use and owners changing the configuration of buildings?
Not that we're aware of. No, we didn't come across that.
Okay.
I read an interesting article in the Climate magazine where our director of community development was quoted, and interesting history about Industrial Road in the east side of San Carlos over many, many years, and the changes there that have happened and fitting in with the master plan update 9 years ago that was made. So I'm wondering if there's any significant parking problem there yet, and if not, will there, since there are more and more wineries and brew pub places and artisans shops in addition to biotech buildings, that there won't be some eventually more and more parking problems in that area, that we might adopt this sometime later.
Well, right now, there are certain pockets of that area where it depends on the uses, but sometimes some of the uses do use the public parking areas for overflow parking for whatever they're doing. I think as we see more newer development, they will want to have the parking on their properties, particularly in the Class A offices that we're seeing over there, because they won't be able to demand the lease rates that they want and the convenience factor for the employees that will be working there. So in some of the areas where we're seeing the most change, you'll see more on-site parking, which will likely relieve some of the pressure that's on the streets currently. In some of the areas like the industrial arts area, it's sort of smaller and more compact, and the lots are closer together. And, we're seeing that, there's some issues around parking, but not quite as much. And some, it depends on the uses in the, like 24-hour fitness. There's a lot of people that come at a certain time. There's sometimes there's events because we have some kind of like cultural uses down there. And so, there are some pressures, but we may see change over the years, and it, likely in some of these bigger parcel areas rather than like the industrial arts, you probably won't see as much change in terms of parking.
Thank you.
Can the in lieu fee that's collected, say for the red outlined district, be applied to benefit the green area? Is it all one, or is it district specific?
They were created, there's a lot of background information, as you could imagine, something that was put into place in the 1950s and 1960s. We don't have all of that information readily at hand, but I can tell the Commission, and I believe this was mentioned in the presentation, that each of these districts were adopted in certain years, and so they were all adopted by different ordinances, so they've been applied here versus different color codes to to indicate which year. I don't know for certain if the funds collected in the red zone can be used, say, over in the green zone. I think that's something that we would have to look into. I don't know if that's something that staff.
My understanding is that they can.
Sure.
It can be, because if we look at the studies we're doing, they often affect a larger area rather than just one specific assessment district. So I believe they can be spread across different districts.
Otherwise, it's pretty complicated with the overlaps.
Yeah.
I think one of them is just Wheeler Plaza, so it would be pretty tight squeeze.
Is there any provision potentially to have one fee for an existing place? For instance, the retail operation that got converted to a piano bar. That seemed like a pretty high burden on that business. But on the other hand, if somebody were putting up a new building, which has a much larger scale of potential profit, they're a $25,000 getting out of providing parking may be quite a bargain. So I don't know. I'm just wondering whether existing businesses could be handled differently than new construction.
Based on the size of the development, kind of what you're saying.
Well, if it's an existing building versus new construction.
So at the moment, we don't really have any sort of sliding scale, but where I think that does come into play is that there's the different parking requirements based on the land use. So the larger project you're developing is going to require a lot more parking spaces and have to pay a much higher fee than the smaller conversion that just requires 8.
Just because of the number of spaces.
But that's the only way where the difference would come from.
And through the chair, the other thing I'd like to note is that when if a property owner chose to work with a developer and completely scrape the entire building, right now it's almost like they have a credit for what's existing. It's like legal nonconforming, the same way we treat all projects. So if you were to demo a specific site, whatever you choose to put on that site, you have to meet the parking requirement in full for the full square footage of whatever it is that's going to be there. So I think the idea with the in-lieu fees is that because these sites are rather small, individual sites, individually owned, the in-lieu fee option helps owners to be able to adjust and evolve the different uses over time, where they want to do a slight addition or some changes in use without having to go back and pay the full parking or meet the full or original parking requirement back from the 50s or 60s. So, but I just wanted to clarify that if you were to scrape and rebuild, you'd have to provide all of the parking for that new use and all the square footages, whatever that building was made up of.
In the work that the city has done in the past decade, which of the tactics, either funded by this fund or elsewise, have shown the most effective at actually reducing the demand for parking in the commercial and in the the commercial area? Has it been transit passes? Has it been shuttles to remote lots? Like therefore, if we had a wish to spend more money on it, what's been successful, and what would we want to put this revenue toward?
So the question's about reduction of parking demand, right?
Yeah, reducing demand.
Reducing demand and what's most effective. And I think we can maybe look back at our TDM, our Transportation Demand Management Ordinance. And for instance, and Lisa, please chime in here, but what that does is it says that if you meet certain criteria or do certain things or give certain things, then you need to reduce your overall parking ratio by a certain percentage, right? Or your traffic by a certain percentage. And so by reducing the traffic that comes to your project, you're also reducing the potential parking impacts of that project as well. So, you know, we look at things like transit passes, and those seem to, people anecdotally seem to really like when the businesses provide those. They're not that cheap, and we talk to our own employees, and some people use the trains, and they, it's not an inexpensive thing if you're going to take the train, 3, 4, 5 days a week. So those tend to be effective in reducing parking in the downtown. So public transit is a big thing, and trying to get people to and from public transit and out of their cars. Whatever we can do, whatever we can incentivize, or the development can do to reduce single occupancy vehicles on the street is really what we've seen as effective. Can you think of anything else? I mean, I think that would probably be one of the top ones.
I would say that in recent years, whenever projects triggered the city's TDM, Transportation Demand Management Ordinance, there is a menu of certain options or strategies that a developer could propose, and some of the most, I guess, favored or what seems to make a big difference are the transit passes. There's other things like providing long-term bicycle parking within the development, informational kiosks to let people know, where they can go to get information about public transit, whether taking, buses or the Caltrain, other options such as dialing a ride or getting certain services through like Samtrans. But I would say transit passes seem to be most effective. And for some of the larger projects that have come forward, that was a critical piece or crucial piece in getting their TDM plan approved. So the TDM plan kicks in whenever you have, I believe it's 10 units or more, 10 residential units or more, or when you're building a new project that consists of 10,000 square feet or more. So the TDM doesn't necessarily kick in when a new operator comes in and new restaurant owner comes in, they change the name, it's a totally new menu. It won't kick in then. It only kicks in for new development of 10 units or more or 10,000 square feet or more. But we've had quite a few come in, and so a lot of them have offered the transit passes, which seem to be the kind of the strategy that gets them over to help them meet their 20% reduction in trips, which is required through TDM as well.
And one last thing I'd like to mention is, as planners looking out to the future as commissioners, one thing to consider is autonomous vehicles. And there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of research, and a lot of analysis about, well, what does that mean for cities? And one of the things that people believe it means for cities is the reduction of parking garages and needed parking on site. And the idea would be that these vehicles would kind of circulate around, and you'd be able to get one or from your point of departure, and again, it wouldn't need to park necessarily, it would just kind of keep circulating. So one of the concerns about the future of these parking garages is, will we have a bunch of dead space in 10, 15, 20 years? What do our downtowns look like? What do these big warehouses look like in 20 years? And there are many people who believe that they will be unnecessary in a period of time. Just something to think about.
I was talking with someone from SFO the other day, and that huge short-term parking garage that they have is exactly as you say, mostly empty. So they're now embarking on a big plan to reconfigure that whole garage and to use the space in other ways other than for providing short-term parking. And one of the other things I was wondering about is when Caltrain is electrified and is able to stop in San Carlos on a regular, more frequent basis, might that get other people out of their cars and result in less need for parking? Similarly, I believe Samtrans is going to put in some longer commute express buses, which also is very positive and may have a positive effect on reduced traffic and reduced need for parking.
I'm glad we have some reason to be optimistic about long-term parking, but like Commissioner Bradley, I appreciate your comments about how much development might be happening on our east side. And for example, like that Alexandria Associates building that's going up now, did that TDM plan, did that discuss parking impacts on Laurel, or is it just sort of circulation in their area? Because I'm reflecting on if we really do allow the number of potential jobs to come in, that the east side, even under what's currently, I think, being considered, if they are not going to bring housing and maybe their own retail or restaurants, that's going to be tremendous impact on parking in Laurel, I believe. And is that do we have any sense of the magnitude of that impact on Laurel, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sense of it, and there's a couple of things about that. One is starting with the business itself, and what we've learned about these businesses is that they would prefer that you stayed there, and for productivity purposes, right? And I guess that's what we've seen in Silicon Valley, where you have the really good food on campus, you have gyms, you have for instance, on that particular at Alexandria, we worked with them a long time on how many bikes they would have there and where they would. There's a huge bike shelter, and we talked about how bikes can actually get in the building. Are the elevators big enough, and where are the entrances for those things? And it was really forward thinking and trying to keep those people on. And then if they do want to leave, what kind of transportation do they use to get off campus? And many of them will have shuttles. That one will have a shuttle. We believe that future developments in that area will have campus shuttles and buses and things that will take groups of people off campus. In addition to that, we're probably going to see more services over there, maybe dry cleaners, dog grooming, gyms, restaurants, and we believe that those things will be open to the rest of the community as well and not be closed off. Like in the past in Silicon Valley, there was a lot of security issues and protection of intellectual property rights and things. But we believe that, and what we're seeing and what cities want is a more open campus so that those people stay there. But not only do they stay there, but we can go there. And sure, our downtown is an amenity and an asset for those businesses, and they see it as such. We do need to do a better job with mobility in terms of trying to get those employees down to downtown if they want to walk. We need to make it more walkable and bikeable and micro transportation, scooters and things like that. So we do need to improve those things, but that's what we want to see, and that's what we think they want to see too. But there could be some more impacts, of course, in downtown San Carlos. They're not going to want to get stuck in traffic or parking either. They're going to want to get in and out quickly.
Yeah, I appreciate that overview. That is helpful. Just specifically on those shuttles, I think as I've seen shuttles proposed, they only last for like 5 years or something. Are these like shuttles longer term than that? Are they intended to run forever? How do we think about shuttles?
I think the businesses are going to need, they will want to have their own distinct shuttles for their businesses. And the question is, how do we get into the discussion about opening that up if there is an opening to other businesses? Is there an agency that manages all traffic in that area? And all the shuttles just go around to all the businesses as opposed to having a shuttle service just for that business. So that's something we will need to look at with the new projects that are coming forward. Is it just one big system as opposed to individual systems? That's kind of how they're looking at it right now is, hey, it's our business. We want to get our our employees to and from our campus. And that's how they're kind of looking at it. But I know that they're open to other ways of doing business too.
Is there any interest in looking at rideshare drop-off and pickup locations? And might that be something that this in lieu parking fund could fund a study for? I see you using rideshare even more in the future, and Laurel Street, and how might it accommodate that in a different way than it currently does?
Yeah, I think that in reading the resolution for how this fund can be used, that's something that most likely could be used for.
Thank you.
Can you clarify for the study, or actually helping small business people maybe give coupons, rideshare coupons for patrons?
I think what the ordinance says is that it's the city. The way I read it, and again, I think it's more of a legal question how you read it, but I read it that the city can give these passes to somebody. It doesn't say that the city can give the money to the business owner then to give to somebody else. I don't believe. In fact, I think that might be a gift of public funds unless it was a grant program that the city had, which we don't currently.
But you could see, maybe to pick up on Ellen's point, you could see, let's say, a deal with Lyft and Uber where, so many $5,000 a month to each one of those companies to create a bank of rides, and businesses would be allowed in these areas, for example, would be allowed to use it, draw on that bank to reduce parking.
Yeah, that's a great idea for the commission to consider for future development projects that come before you. And in fact, I think that town has actually offered a discount on rideshare as a result of their outdoor seating area, because they took away parking. So they gave some of their patrons a reduction in the cost of ride sharing.
I actually think they owe us a report back this year, if I'm not mistaken.
So I guess I'm still struck by the notion that if you change from retail to restaurant and then back to retail and back to restaurant, I think that's very foreseeable. Businesses have a hard time making a go of it with the type of rents that get asked on Laurel Street in particular. I know, every couple years, a lot of the names down there seem to change. So I'm not sure if there is a good, it seems to me that if we're asking someone to pay an in lieu fee, that should be for the life of that building under that provision. An alternative that just occurred to me is, retail's under particular pressure. And I think maybe, I don't know, I personally get sad when I see restaurants kind of taking over Laurel. I like a good restaurant too, but I think we'll all miss having kind of nice retail shops as well. It occurred to me, it's kind of interesting, if retail's 2.5 spaces and restaurants are 4 spaces and we're building up this fund, if you're going to go from a retail to a restaurant, you have to build more spaces. But if you're going from a restaurant down to retail, maybe you should get a credit and even a subsidy back for returning that use of space back to the community. Just throwing it out there as that would operate as a subsidy, if you will, for retail over restaurant, and retail by our own code as a lower parking impact.
Chair Dugan, the one thing that I would offer is, in terms of that particular scenario where a current retail space then becomes restaurant, as you noted, the parking requirement for retail is higher than for a restaurant is higher than for retail. So in a scenario where then that restaurant converted back to a retail, it's very unlikely, because the parking requirement is lower for retail, that particular change in use is going to trigger the parking requirement.
That makes sense.
In a scenario, if we're looking from retail to restaurant and then back to retail, that particular retail that comes in, their parking demand is going to be lower than what the current parking under that restaurant scenario would be. So they wouldn't be impacted by having to, find off-site or possibly pay in lieu. The scenario for that would be highly unlikely, unless, of course, that they wanted to add on to the building. And so then you have all that additional square footage to factor in.
Got it. So, but I guess as proposed, this does operate as a bit of a longer-term tax against restaurants, if you will, because if you go from retail to restaurant back to retail, you're then going to be back in this regime when you try to put that next restaurant back in. But I understand if it's been, and if those spaces have never been built, then every time it goes back to a restaurant, they're going to have to pay that in lieu fee because those spaces don't exist. Yeah. Okay. And we do have a public comment period, but I'm not aware of any speaker cards. Do we get any speaker cards or anything?
No speaker cards.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, anything else of staff, or should we deliberate directly?
I'm ready to deliberate.
All right.
To me, what the number should be, is 25K the right number, is one question. And when I look at Laurel Street and where this is being applied, it's relatively small scale sorts of establishments compared to, say, I don't know where the district is in Mountain View where we have the cost comparison, but some of those areas are fairly are larger scale and seem better able to accommodate a bigger parking tax in lieu fee. So the 25,000 kind of calibrating it to the scale of things is one way to look at it. The other way to look at it, of course, is, in lieu should be calibrated to how much it costs to build the parking spot, which they calculated at 77,000, which is quite a lot. We're stuck with sort of a trade-off situation of not inhibiting economic development and activity versus addressing our parking, and I'm just quite happy to hear more broadly than just parking, but transportation solutions in general.
It is a balance, and I appreciated hearing what the other nearby cities have been doing. That was very helpful, and I think $25,000 is a reasonable place to start to balance, as you say, the economic development with the parking issues.
Yeah, I'm still just a bit troubled by the difference between a tenant trying to change a use and someone constructing a whole new development. It just seems odd to me that those get treated exactly the same. Maybe it's appropriate. This is about parking and are there enough spaces? Yeah, I'm just struck by that. I'm not sure if there's anything we can do about that.
It would appear that if you were to look beyond San Carlos, each of the cities has a, maybe this is overreaching, but a recognition that the parking demand from a restaurant facility is, by definition, greater than a retail facility. And so, for example, in Mountain View, I suppose Redwood Cities would be the exception where it's 6 flat, but Mountain View is almost twice. So, if the logic about the difference is your point, it probably is driven by the trips generated or the parking generated. And you also made the point about the back and forth, and I guess the staff would have to say whether that is common enough create some kind of rule around it, but no particular input from my perspective. I think, City Council asked for our perspectives collectively and individually. I think I would say 25,000 seems a good number, 30,000 seems a good number. I think, part of my question would be, and what are we trying to accomplish as a city with that? Especially given that if we're only seeing a couple of actions per year, like what are we really trying to accomplish? If the idea is to generate more fees, then I think one way to do that would be to up the parking requirement per 1,000 square feet, and that would generate more actions per year. But again, would it really, at the end of the day, be material? And I think, we've all touched on the fact that you'd have to believe an awful lot of action in development over the coming even decade to generate a pool of even $10 million or half of a parking structure. And so for my part, I don't actually see this as practical as a way to fund a parking facility. So then, staff's comments about, well, other very good uses for this money to subsidize ways to avoid parking, and that seems like a rich vein to pursue. Again, some quick looking, I'm not a Caltrain user, but monthly pass of 170, call it $200. I mean, $25,000 buys you almost 10 years worth of, for one person, of a Caltrain pass, which is a pretty nice incentive to not take the car. And so that again leads me to why 25,000, 30,000 would be a good number, because we have an effective way of mitigating the need for parking and an economic balance between the alternative and the fee.
$25,000 is a pretty good deal when you take into account the parking requirements in San Carlos per 1,000 square feet are lower than some of the comparables, which is part of the point you were making. Yeah. And also observe that. And so in terms of, are we hitting the sweet spot? It seems like we're at the low end of the range especially when you take that perspective.
Yeah, I guess I could share that observation. It is true our ratios are generally lower, and 25,000 kind of puts us still on the bottom of the range. We're not moving higher. Was a higher amount, I know we did those other studies, but even just somewhat higher amount like 30,000, did we think that would have a significantly different impact on behaviors in the town?
We didn't study 30,000 specifically. We could go back to EPS and look at that, though, if we wanted to get a more exact number. I think because the range was so broad from our current rate to the 77,000, we were taking bigger chunks. But if people feel better about the 25,000 amount, then that might help narrow us down to a more precise study of intervals of 5,000 rather than 25,000.
It looks kind of linear in this table 4, and if it weren't 8 o'clock, I could probably calculate it. But somewhere, 25,000 is probably pushing in prototype A up closer to 9% or 8% of increase, and maybe 16% on the prototype B. So some increase. I suppose it's 20% of the difference between the two, so.
Yeah, I agree. It does look fairly linear.
Except for that 0.5%, which I think is a typo.
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah, that said, I would say, it's always important to note when you're making a significant change in anything as a government that, you should pause a bit. This 25,000 does represent a 40% increase, which that's certainly not nothing when it comes to, a five-figure, many $1,000 fee. So, maybe 25 is the right number.
Do you know if council has, or if the ordinance allows for this to be paid in over a period of time? So, maybe it's a $40,000 fee, but there's, it's paid in over a 5-year period, and that way it's not all at once a cash flow hit for the developer.
Through the chair and commissioners, the fees are due upon building permit issuance, so that is when they're collected, and they've been collected in full the 2 times that we have collected. I don't know if there is an ability to do that. That's something we'd have to check with our city attorney. I mean, certainly something that could be proposed, and we'd have to get a response to. But so far, both developers in those 2 occasions have paid the fee in full when it was due.
Good idea, though. I like that.
Well, if you extended it out over enough time, that would also partially mitigate the tenant versus owner
That's right.
issue as well.
It de-risks the expense a little
Yeah.
if your business is going to fail.
And just to be clear, we're not approving this. This becomes a recommendation to City Council. Is that correct?
That's right. We're just gathering comments right now that we can then bring to the council.
Got it. So there is no motion for us this evening?
No motion.
Okay. Simply recommendation. At this point, I'd be comfortable recommending a change to 25,000. I think I could support 30,000, but a 40% increase in a large fee is not nothing, and we can certainly revisit it over time if need be. So I think staff did find a reasonable ground, trying not to hit developers too hard, and my inclination to be not overly aggressive on this fee is partially because it applies to tenants as well, and that's tough. Thinking about that restaurant paying, I think it was that $97,000 in parking in lieu?
Piano Bar is about $143,000 for 8 space parking requirement.
Yeah. That said, this does operate as a bit of a tax on converting our retail spaces to restaurants, which I'm not unsettled by that. I don't like seeing all our retail spaces turning into restaurants. So.
I would support the $25,000 fee. I also support the discussion earlier where it could bump up to 30,000. Whichever number it is, I like the idea of continuing to index it to the CPI.
I guess I'll just chime in and say I'm kind of warming up to the idea of a little bit more friction on things turning into restaurants. I support 30,000. Any chance of a consensus on 30,000?
I'd be happy with either 25 or 30. No preference.
I would be happy with 30, partly because our parking requirements are lower than the comparable cities. So really the overall cost for a San Carlos business versus going to Mountain View would be less, even with a $30,000.
Yeah, I think that is a good point as well. And I think 30 would get us off the bottom of this list. And obviously, I can tell you my neighbors are all concerned about parking in the downtown areas. I'm sure yours are as well, which doesn't lend me to think we should be, at the bottom of this list. I mean, we don't know the date these cities jumped their fees last, but we will just be coming onto the bottom of the list at 25,000. So 30,000, definitely feels like a reasonable place for us to be on this.
I would support 30,000.
Okay, through the chair, if there's no further points or any closing remarks you want to make, Adam, we've taken good notes. We'll probably collect some more information before this goes to council, and if there's nothing else to add, that was the only recommendation. Again, as we mentioned, this is not a formal recommendation. There's no change to the zoning ordinance, which of course you as a commission do have purview over, and you make recommendations to council. This is a fee that's adopted by resolution, but of course the council requested that we bring this forth to the Planning Commission for discussion, so we'll be sure to bring your comments forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Nice work on this. Terrific, and good discussion on this, commissioners. I appreciated that. Terrific. Reports, correspondence, and general information. Do we have any of those, Lisa?
Yes, I would like to share with the Planning Commission, if you happen to not watch the last City Council meeting, and a topic came up during the City Council meeting of January 27th, and that had to do with looking into possibly provisions to adopt construction time limits. This came up with the recent discussion about the projects that's happening on Cherry and Chestnut, as well as some of the comments that were made at a prior Planning Commission public hearing for the project at 626 Walnut, just in terms of how long construction was going to take, and does the city have any ability to ensure that construction continues forward to completion on a timely manner. So this was discussed at the City Council level, and they directed staff to bring forward this topic in the context of a study session to the Planning Commission. So our building official, Chris Valley, he is currently working with the City Attorney's Office to bring forward some material in a study session that the Planning Commission can take a look at. So again, this is in regards to construction time limits and how that might be managed and dealt with. As of right now, the project is allowed to continue so long as they have an inspection every 180 days, but I think the Commission is familiar with that. So I did want to share that in terms of recent City Council actions. And that's all I have. I don't believe there's anything else from the Council that crosses over, into the Commission's work at this time.
Terrific. Do we have any sense of how long it'll take staff to consider that shot clock type provision?
I am not sure, but I know that the work has already commenced. We're looking at what other jurisdictions do, where there's work already underway with the City Attorney's Office. So my estimate, it could come forward perhaps maybe sometime in March or April this year. It's being worked on, and I think the idea or sense is to get working on this rather, sooner rather than later is the direction we received.
Got it. Yeah, I think we even had public comment in our Walnut discussion about the fact that the Cherry Street project is in year 5 and still doesn't have a roof. So I can understand why people are bringing this one forward.
And can I just check, this is a combination of both duration and then the so what once that limit's hit, right? What teeth comes after failing to complete by a certain date?
Correct. Yes, that would be both components.
Yeah, it would have to be financial in nature. You can't just say, you go away now. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Terrific. Any correspondence or anything else to discuss?
I did want to mention that I left on the dais just a very basic handout. One of the things that the Commission brought up during your mini retreat last fall in terms of working with staff, kind of getting a sense of what's coming forward, the Commission had requested to be notified in advance of whatever projects are coming forward as our calendar starts to fill up. And so I provided a handout which presents the next topic that will be on the Planning Commission's agenda for this month, as well as the month of March. So there are some items here so you can get a sense of what's coming before you, and if you have any questions on that, you can certainly reach out to staff. But because these are not agendized items, I can't go into the details of these, but they're general enough to get a sense of what they include, and if you'd like some advance information, please reach out to staff.
Terrific. Yeah, thank you for this. This is very helpful. And housing element, APR, what does APR mean?
Yes, thank you. Annual progress report. So every year, the state of California's Community and Housing Department requires that every city and county complete a report to let the state know how we're doing on meeting our regional housing needs allocation, or our RHNA numbers. How many new units were received building permits in the year 2019. A few years ago, the state changed the way that we provide this information. So essentially, we have to provide a lot more robust data, entitlement data. You'll see the full packet come before you. Although we're not required to submit it to the Planning Commission, we know housing is an important topic in this community, and the more that the Commission can be on the same page and understand the RHNA, we have a housing element update coming up. We'll need to complete that before January 1, 2023. So it's a good opportunity to see where we've been, how we did last year, and what we have left to do. And of course, we'll be getting a new RHNA allocation about a year from now. So this is all things that are constantly moving and in flux, and we monitor and we check our progress. And I would definitely like to share that with the Commission before it goes on to the City Council. There's no formal recommendation. It's just to receive the data, which is basically objective data. What comes in, what gets permitted, how many units, how many BMR.
Terrific. Yeah, I look forward to that. It'll be good to understand how that state mandate really hits the ground here. So thank you. Commissioners, any final thoughts or anything for staff?
So the next
Yes.
meeting is a Tuesday? Oh, because Monday's a holiday.
Correct.
I got it, okay.
Yes, I noticed that Senate Bill 50 failed again for the third time last week, but they vowed to bring it back, modify it, and bring it back again soon.
The Frankenstein bill keeps coming back. Very good. All right. With that, we're adjourned. Thank you.